My parents actually took my heirloom wedding ring and handed it to my younger sister. She then married my white fiancé, wearing my custom-altered dress. 2 years later, at an overpriced Sunday brunch, she flashed that exact diamond in my face, laughed, and asked if I was still alone. My mother smirked and told the entire table that my sister simply finishes what I cannot. I did not cry. I did not run. I just checked my phone, stood up, and waited for the heavy oak doors to swing open. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth. We were sitting in the private dining room of the Grandview, an exclusive restaurant in downtown Atlanta, where a single plate of eggs Benedict costs more than a car payment. My mother Yvonne insisted on this location for our mandatory family brunch. She loved places with heavy velvet curtains and waiters who hovered just out of sight, waiting to cater to her every whim. It made her feel powerful to command that kind of space. I sat at the far end of the long, polished mahogany table, sipping sparkling water and watching the familiar performance unfold. Across from me sat my younger sister, Kiara. She was 28 years old and currently wearing at least $50,000 worth of diamonds that our parents had gleefully financed. She adjusted her posture, making sure the light from the crystal chandelier caught the heavy necklace resting against her collarbone. Sitting right next to her was Connor, my former fiancé, the man I was supposed to marry before my family decided he was a better fit for their golden child. Connor is white, a corporate tech guy, who always looked a little too desperate for my father Calvin's approval. Right now he was busy slicing into his steak, avoiding my gaze completely while enjoying the lavish meal my parents were funding. I just cannot believe how beautiful the new house is coming along, my mother Yvonne announced to the table loudly enough for the waitstaff lingering by the door to hear. Kiara, you have such an eye for interior design. Connor is a very lucky man to have a wife who knows how to create a proper home for him. Yvonne took a delicate sip of her mimosa and turned her sharp, calculating gaze toward me. Unlike some people who think staring at computer screens all day constitutes a fulfilling life. Tell me, Zora, are you still living in that same cramped little apartment? Still playing around with that coding hobby of yours? I did not let the insult show on my face. I placed my fork down perfectly aligned with my knife. My fintech company is doing quite well, Mom. It is far from a hobby. I built it from the ground up. Kiara let out a high-pitched laugh that grated on my nerves. Oh, Zora, please. We all know you just type lines of code into the void. Connor is the real tech genius in the family. His software firm is actually doing something that matters. He is building something real. Connor puffed out his chest slightly, adjusting his expensive but slightly mismatched tie. Kiara is right, Zora. It takes aggressive business acumen to survive in this industry. You have always been a bit too stubborn to understand how the real market works. You have to know how to play the game to get ahead. I looked at the man who used to sleep in my bed. The man who had promised me forever before my parents bought him off with promises of seed money and family connections. He looked so thoroughly average, sitting there wrapped in the unearned confidence my father had handed him. Is that so, Connor? I asked, keeping my voice dangerously level. I suppose you would know all about playing games. My father Calvin slammed his coffee cup down on the saucer, making the fine china rattle. Do not use that tone with your brother-in-law, Zora. Connor is providing a wonderful life for your sister. He is building a legacy, something you would know nothing about since you refused to accept any of my guidance. You always were too fiercely independent for your own good. It is no wonder you could not make a man like Connor happy. The sheer audacity of the statement hung in the heavy air of the dining room. He was casually rewriting history right in front of me, erasing the betrayal, and painting me as the difficult, unlovable woman who drove her fiancé away. I looked at Yvonne, expecting at least a shred of maternal decency, but she was simply nodding in agreement. Your father is right, Yvonne added, slicing into her crepe. You have always pushed people away with your rigid attitude. Look at Kiara. She knows how to nurture a relationship. She knows how to be a partner. Kiara preened under the praise. She reached up to push a stray lock of hair behind her ear, an entirely calculated movement designed to put her left hand squarely in my line of sight. And there it was, the ring. It was our grandmother's vintage diamond ring, an exquisite, flawless cut stone set in thick platinum. For my entire life, that ring had been promised to me for my 30th birthday. It was supposed to be mine. Instead, 2 years ago, I stood in my father's study and watched him physically hand that exact ring to Connor. I remember Calvin patting Connor on the back and telling him that it would look much better on Kiara's hand since she actually knew how to keep a man. Kiara wiggled her fingers, letting the vintage diamond catch the light from the chandelier above us. "It really is a stunning piece, is not it?" she said, looking directly at me with a malicious glint in her dark eyes. "Connor says he has never seen a ring suit someone so perfectly. It is almost like it was always meant for me." She took a slow sip of her champagne, her eyes never leaving my face. "Speaking of which, Zora, how is your love life? Still alone?" The table went dead silent. Connor actually smirked, looking down at his plate to hide his amusement. Calvin crossed his arms, looking at me as if waiting for me to break down and apologize for my mere existence. Yvonne leaned forward, resting her elbows on the mahogany table. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and triumph, a look she had perfected over 3 decades of emotional manipulation. "Now, Kiara, do not tease your sister. It is not her fault she struggles to hold on to things. She just lacks follow-through." Yvonne smiled, a razor-sharp smirk that exposed all her teeth. "She always finishes what you cannot, Zora. That is just the natural order of things." They were waiting for the explosion. They were waiting for the tears, for the dramatic exit, for the validation that they had broken me entirely. For 20 years, I would have given them exactly what they wanted. I would have yelled. I would have cried. I would have stormed out of the restaurant feeling small and defeated and thoroughly crushed by the weight of their synchronized cruelty. But I was not that broken woman anymore. I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear. I did not reach for my designer bag to run away from the table. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, the screen illuminated with a single text message from a private number. "Arriving now." I placed the phone face down on the table. I picked up my linen napkin, wiped the corners of my mouth, and slowly stood up from my chair. I smoothed down the front of my tailored emerald green blazer, a custom piece that cost more than Kiara's entire brunch outfit combined. I kept my posture perfectly straight, projecting an aura of absolute unbothered calm. "What are you doing?" Calvin barked, clearly annoyed that I was not following his expected script of playing the victim. "Sit down. We are not finished eating. I am just stretching my legs." "Dad?" I replied, my voice smooth and chillingly pleasant. "I am waiting for someone." "Waiting for someone." Kiara laughed, exchanging a mocking glance with Connor. "Who could you possibly be waiting for, Zora? Your imaginary boyfriend." I did not answer her. I just turned my gaze away from their toxic little circle and looked straight toward the back of the room. The heavy oak doors of the private dining suite were closed, but I could hear the faint sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside. Firm, confident, powerful footsteps. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. My silence was unnerving them. Yvonne opened her mouth to launch another carefully crafted insult, but the words died in her throat as the heavy brass handles of the oak doors turned and the doors swung open with a smooth, authoritative sweep. The heavy brass handles of the oak doors turned and they swung open with a smooth, authoritative sweep. The restaurant general manager stepped aside immediately, his head bowed in absolute deference. Xavier stepped into the private dining room and the very air pressure seemed to change. He was 35 years old and moved with the kind of quiet, lethal grace that only true power affords. Dressed in a bespoke charcoal Tom Ford suit that hugged his broad shoulders perfectly, he looked like a king inspecting a rather unimpressive province. His presence was a massive gravitational pull. He did not look at my mother. He did not spare a single glance for my sister or the pale, arrogant man sitting beside her. His dark, intense eyes found mine instantly. I watched my family process his arrival. The condescending laughter that had been bouncing off the velvet walls died in an instant. Kiara's mouth snapped shut so fast her teeth clicked. Yvonne froze with her mimosa glass suspended halfway to her lips, her smug expression melting into utter bewilderment. Xavier walked the length of the room, his handmade leather shoes making no sound on the thick carpet. When he reached my chair, he leaned down and pressed a warm, lingering kiss to my cheek. He smelled of rich cedar and something impossibly expensive. He straightened up and handed me a sleek black leather portfolio. The gold monogram on the corner caught the chandelier light. I placed it gently on the mahogany table right next to my sparkling water. My father Calvin was staring at Xavier as if an apparition had just materialized in the restaurant. A loud, sharp clatter shattered the silence. Calvin had literally dropped his heavy silver fork directly onto his fine china plate. My father is a man who built his entire identity on knowing every major player in the Atlanta business world. He reads financial portfolios the way other men read the morning news. He knew exactly who was standing next to me. Xavier was not just a wealthy man. He was the venture capital titan who essentially controlled half of the city's commercial real estate. A ghost to the local media, but an absolute god in the boardroom. Before my father could force his vocal cords to work, Xavier raised a single hand signaling the hovering waiter. "We will take a bottle of the Cristal Gold Medallion," Xavier said, his voice a rich, deep baritone that commanded the space effortlessly. "Bring 2 glasses, please. I want to celebrate my wife." The word hit the table like a live grenade. Wife. Yvonne actually choked, coughing violently into her linen napkin. Her perfectly applied lipstick smeared slightly as she stared at me, her eyes wide with a frantic mixture of confusion and horror. Kiara gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning ashen. She looked from the vintage diamond on her left hand to my bare fingers, and then up to Xavier's towering figure. Her brain was short-circuiting, trying to comprehend how the sister she had just dismissed as a lonely, broken spinster was sitting here with a man who could buy and sell their entire neighborhood before lunch. Connor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his pale face flushing dull red. He was used to being the smartest, wealthiest man in any room my parents put him in. He was the golden son-in-law, the tech founder, the man who had stolen me blind and been rewarded for it. But next to Xavier, Connor looked exactly like what he was, a boy playing dress-up in a tailored suit. Connor puffed out his chest, trying to reclaim the alpha status he felt slipping rapidly away. He leaned back aggressively and let his eyes roam over Xavier, his gaze snagged on Xavier's wrist. "Is that a custom?" Patek Philippe, Connor asked, his tone laced with that specific brand of arrogant condescension he always used when he felt threatened. "A bit flashy for a Sunday brunch, do not you think? I mean, real wealth whispers, right? That looks like you are trying a bit too hard to make an impression." I watched my father close his eyes in silent mortification. Calvin knew the watch was custom, and he knew exactly what it cost. Connor, on the other hand, was just digging his own grave with a silver spoon. Xavier did not bristle. He did not get defensive. He merely smiled. It was a terrifying, beautifully calm smile. He adjusted his cuff, letting the timepiece slide gracefully back under the immaculate fabric of his suit. "I suppose it is a matter of perspective," Xavier said smoothly, leaning forward slightly and placing both hands on the back of my chair. "But we did not come here to discuss horology, Connor. In fact, we did not even come here for the food. My wife simply mentioned she was having brunch with her relatives, and I realized it was the perfect opportunity to save my courier a trip across town." Connor frowned, his bravado faltering for a fraction of a second. "A courier? What are you talking about?" Xavier gestured gracefully toward the sleek black leather portfolio sitting on the table in front of me. "I am talking about a delivery, Connor. A formal legal notice regarding the commercial lease for your tech firm's headquarters. It seems my holding company finalized the acquisition of your building late last night." Connor stared across the table, his arrogant sneer completely dissolving into a mask of pure confusion. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly white against his expensive collar. He blinked rapidly, looking from Xavier to me, and then down to the black leather portfolio I was resting my hands on. He tried to laugh, but the sound came out like a dry gasp. You cannot buy that property. Connor stammered, his voice losing all its previous tech founder bravado. My firm has a 10-year ironclad commercial lease. I watched his eyes dart nervously toward the portfolio, and in that split second, I saw the exact same expression of calculated greed he wore 2 years ago. The memory hit me with sharp, blinding clarity, not as a distant thought, but as a visceral physical sensation, perfectly integrated into the current moment. I looked right at the vintage diamond currently flashing on my sister's finger, and the opulent private dining room faded away. I was standing in my father's study. The air was thick with the scent of Calvin's expensive cigars and lemon oil wood polish. I had walked in just in time to see my father holding a small velvet box. Inside rested my grandmother's ring, the flawless platinum band, the intricate setting, the diamond that had been promised to me since I was 10 years old. I stood frozen in the doorway as my father physically pressed the box into Connor's pale hands. Connor was my fiancé then, but he took the box without a single ounce of hesitation or guilt. I remember the exact words my father used as he clapped Connor on the shoulder. He told him the ring would look much better on Kiara's hand. He said Kiara actually knew how to keep a man happy, while I was too fiercely independent, too obsessed with writing code to ever be a proper wife. And Connor, the man who had slept beside me for 3 years, just smiled, slipped my birthright into his pocket, and agreed. Snapping back to the present, I kept my eyes locked on Connor's panicked face. You always did have a habit of taking things that did not belong to you, Connor. I said, my voice dangerously soft but carrying perfectly across the silent room. You take things you have not earned and you assume there will be no consequences. But real estate, unlike my family's loyalty, is not something you can simply charm your way into. I unzipped the leather portfolio and pulled out the first crisp white document. It was stamped with the official seal of the City Commercial Zoning Board. I slid it slowly across the polished mahogany table, letting it come to rest right next to Kiara's untouched mimosa. Xavier adjusted his suit jacket and looked down at Connor with the mild, detached interest of a man inspecting an insect. My legal team audited the previous owner's contracts this morning. Xavier explained, his tone entirely conversational. It turns out your ironclad lease contained a standard transfer of ownership dissolution clause. A clause your remarkably incompetent legal team failed to strike during your initial negotiations. As the new owner of the property, I have the legal right to restructure the building's usage. We are converting your floor into luxury private suites. Kiara snatched the paper from the table, her diamond glittering as her eyes scanned the legal jargon she clearly did not understand. You cannot just kick us out, she snapped, glaring at Xavier. Connor has a massive team in that building. Where are they supposed to go? I am not kicking anyone out, Kiara, I replied, folding my hands together on the table. I am simply serving a 30-day notice of a rent increase. The new monthly premium for your current square footage is listed on page 2. Connor leaned over his wife's shoulder and looked at the number. His jaw dropped open. This is a 400% increase. He choked out, his voice pitching an octave higher. This is extortion. No startup can carry this kind of overhead. You are trying to bankrupt my company. I smiled, feeling a deep, profound sense of peace settling into my bones. I am doing absolutely nothing of the sort, Connor. I am simply playing the game. Is not that what you just told me a few minutes ago? You said it takes aggressive business acumen to survive in this industry. I am just adjusting the market rate to reflect the true value of the space. If your revolutionary software company cannot afford the overhead, perhaps you are not the tech genius my family believes you to be. Yvonne slammed her hands down on the table, making the silverware jump. This is absolutely ridiculous, she shouted, pointing a trembling finger at me. You are doing this out of pure spite, Zora. You are bitter because Connor realized he deserved a woman with actual class and grace. You bring this man here to bully us just because you are jealous of your sister's perfect life. Xavier stepped slightly in front of my chair, shielding me from my mother's aggressive posture. I would choose my next words very carefully, Yvonne Xavier said, his voice dropping an octave, sending a very clear, very cold warning through the room. My wife does not need me to bully anyone. I simply bought a building because she mentioned the architecture was pretty. What she does with the tenants inside is entirely her business. I suggest you lower your voice before I decide to buy the country club where you spend your Tuesday afternoons and revoke your membership. Yvonne's mouth snapped shut, her face turning a mottled shade of red. She looked to my father for help, silently begging him to reclaim control of the room. Calvin had been sitting rigid, his mind clearly calculating the shifting power dynamics. He was a man who worshipped wealth, and right now he was staring at a man whose net worth dwarfed his entire logistical empire. But Calvin's ego could not handle being bested by the daughter he had discarded. Calvin slowly stood up, buttoning his suit jacket, projecting his chest outward. He looked at the lease document on the table and let out a loud, dismissive scoff. A building lease means absolutely nothing, he declared, his voice booming with forced authority. You think raising the rent is going to break this family? You think this little real estate stunt makes you powerful, Zora? Calvin walked over to Connor and placed a heavy hand on his son-in-law's shoulder, mirroring the exact gesture from 2 years ago in his study. Connor's software firm is going public tomorrow morning, Calvin announced, a triumphant grin spreading across his face. The initial public offering is going to make Connor and Kiara richer than you could ever dream. They will buy 10 buildings by the end of the week. You are wasting your time trying to rattle us over office space. We are about to be untouchable. I looked at my father, watching the absolute arrogant certainty in his eyes. I looked at Kiara, who was now smirking again, resting her hand on Connor's arm. And then I looked at Connor, who was staring at me with a mixture of defiance and desperate relief. They honestly believed their stolen victory was secure. They believed they had won. I let the silence stretch out for 3 long seconds. Then I smiled a smile so cold it made my mother physically flinch. I had been counting on my father saying exactly that. My father leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest with a look of absolute triumph. He genuinely believed his mention of the initial public offering had successfully neutralized the threat Xavier posed. In my father's mind, commercial real estate was a slow, archaic game, while tech IPOs were the undisputed peak of modern financial dominance. He looked at me expecting to see defeat, expecting to see the familiar quiet resignation I had worn my entire childhood. Instead, I just smiled at him, a steady, unblinking smile that made the confident posture of his shoulders falter just a fraction of an inch. My mother, Yvonne, sensing the subtle shift in power, immediately rushed to fill the silence. She reached across the table and placed her perfectly manicured hand over Kiara's, flashing her own impressive array of diamonds. She let out a soft, condescending sigh, treating me to a look of profound maternal pity. You can buy all the office buildings in the city, Xavier, my mother said, her voice dripping with that specific brand of elite socialite venom. But concrete and steel do not make a legacy. Family makes a legacy. A successful union makes a legacy. Connor and Kiara have built a beautiful life together. They are true partners. They understand compromise and grace, something Zora has unfortunately always lacked. You can buy her expensive champagne to make her feel better about her choices, but at the end of the day, she is still the woman who drove a good man away because she could not learn how to simply be a wife. She patted Kiara's hand affectionately. Kiara was such a beautiful bride, my mother continued, looking around the private dining room as if addressing an audience. She stepped into the role so naturally. She brought a warmth to that wedding day that Zora never could have managed. Some women are just born to be cherished and protected. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, letting the cool liquid soothe my throat. I set the crystal glass down without making a single sound. Stepped into the role, I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. That is an interesting way to phrase it, Mom. Though I suppose stepping into my custom-tailored French silk wedding gown was quite literally stepping into my role. The color drained from Kiara's face. She dropped her hand from my mother's grip and tucked it beneath the table. I did not raise my voice. I did not let a single tremor of emotion enter my tone. I spoke with the precise surgical detachment of a forensic accountant reading an audit. It was a brilliant piece of logistics, Mom, I will give you, that I said, keeping my gaze locked on my mother's widening eyes. I spent 6 months working with the designer in New York, selecting the Chantilly lace, agonizing over the beadwork, making sure the train fell exactly right. And then 3 weeks before the wedding, I walked into the boutique for my final fitting, only to find the seamstress in tears. She told me my mother had already picked up the garment. I thought it was a misunderstanding, until I found out you drove it straight to Madame Celine in Buckhead. You paid her double her usual rush fee to take the waist in 3 inches and let out the bust so it would fit Kiara perfectly. Connor stared intensely at his untouched steak, his jaw working furiously as he chewed on the inside of his cheek. He knew. He had always known. You dressed my sister in the exact gown meant for my body. I continued the rhythmic cadence of my voice, leaving them no room to interrupt. You let her walk down the aisle in my dress, wearing my grandmother's vintage diamond ring, toward the man who had been sleeping in my bed just a month prior. You orchestrated a hostile takeover of my entire life, so your golden child would not have to experience the inconvenience of planning her own wedding. My mother sat rigid, her chest heaving as she struggled to maintain her composure. She opened her mouth to speak, but I turned my attention directly to my father, cutting her off completely. "And you, Dad," I said softly. "I remember the exact smell of your scotch when I walked into your study that night, demanding to know how you could let this happen. I remember how you did not even have the basic decency to look up from your Financial Times." Calvin swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against his stiff white collar. I quoted his words back to him, word for agonizing word, ensuring Xavier heard every single syllable of the betrayal. "You told me I was too fiercely independent to make a man like Connor happy anyway. You said a man needs a supportive wife, not a business partner who challenges him at every turn. You looked me in the eye and told me Kiara understood surrender, while I only understood control. You told me I brought this on myself because I cared more about writing code than I did about keeping my fiancé satisfied." The heavy silence in the private dining room was suffocating. The absolute calm in my delivery made the brutality of their actions sound 10 times worse. I was not crying. I was not seeking their apology. I was holding up a mirror to their profound ugliness and forcing them to stare at their own reflections. Xavier stood perfectly still beside my chair, his hand resting lightly on the mahogany wood behind my shoulder. He did not need to shout or threaten them. His silent, towering presence amplified every word I spoke, letting them know that the man standing beside me fully recognized them for the monsters they were. The sheer weight of the humiliation was too much for Kiara's fragile ego. She hated being exposed. She hated that her perfect, highly curated image was being dismantled piece by piece in front of a billionaire whose approval she desperately craved. Her chest heaved, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the ugly red flush creeping up her neck. She slammed her mimosa glass down on the table with so much force the crystal stem nearly snapped. Orange juice and champagne sloshed over the rim, staining the pristine white tablecloth. "You are a liar!" Kiara screamed, her voice shrill and unhinged, echoing sharply off the velvet walls. "You are a bitter, jealous liar. You have always been jealous of me. You are sitting here trying to ruin my marriage because you are nothing but a miserable broke coder who spends her entire life staring at a screen." She pointed a trembling diamond-clad finger at me, her chest heaving with desperate fury. "You have absolutely nothing, Zora. You live in a fantasy world. You bring this man here to intimidate us, but we all know the truth. You are riding his coattails. You have no money, no power, and no legacy. You are a failure, and you are just furious that Connor chose a real woman over a cold, unfeeling machine. I dare you to prove you have anything of your own. I dare you." Kiara's shrill dare hung in the stagnant air of the private dining room. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match her frantic energy. I simply leaned forward, resting my forearms on the polished mahogany table, and locked my eyes onto Connor. The sudden movement made him flinch, pressing his back hard against the plush upholstery of his chair. "You honestly believe I care about a dress, Kiara?" I asked, my voice a deadly calm whisper that somehow commanded every square inch of the room. You think I spent the last 2 years plotting over a catering menu and a floral arrangement. You are so delightfully small-minded. I turned my attention fully to the pale, sweating man sitting beside her. Let us talk about the real theft, Connor. Let us talk about the night my father actually threw me out into the street. Connor swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically toward my father. Calvin stiffened his jaw, clenching tightly. You did not just try to break my heart that night. I continued my words, slicing through the heavy silence like a scalpel. You tried to break my bank account. You tried to steal my mind. I watched Connor's arrogance completely evaporate, replaced by a stark, naked terror. I let the memory wash over the room, pulling them back to that rainy Tuesday night 2 years ago. I had been sitting at the kitchen island running the final diagnostic tests on the proprietary financial prediction algorithm I had spent 3 grueling years coding from scratch. It was a revolutionary piece of fintech architecture designed to anticipate market fluctuations with unprecedented accuracy. I had poured my blood, sweat, and thousands of isolated sleepless hours into those complex lines of code. Then my father had walked into the kitchen with Connor trailing behind him like a loyal, obedient dog. Calvin had tossed a thick stack of legal documents onto the marble counter right over my keyboard. It was a patent application and an equity agreement listing Connor as the 50% co-founder and lead developer of my software. I remember looking up at Connor expecting him to explain the massive mistake. Instead, he stood there with his hands tucked casually into his pockets and offered me a smug, condescending smile. He told me we had brainstormed the idea together over dinner once. He claimed that because he had casually mentioned a few basic market parameters, he was legally and morally entitled to half of my life's work. When I flatly refused to sign away my intellectual property, my father delivered his ultimatum. Calvin had leaned over the counter, his face inches from mine, and told me that I lived under his roof and used his resources. He told me that Connor was a real businessman who actually understood how to monetize software while I was just a girl playing with numbers. Sign the equity agreement, Calvin had demanded, his voice echoing in the large kitchen, or pack your bags and get out of my house. Failures do not get to dictate terms to their betters. Yvonne shifted uncomfortably in her chair at the restaurant, clearly remembering how she had stood in the kitchen doorway sipping her chamomile tea and watching me get evicted without saying a single word to defend her own daughter. You thought you had backed me into an impossible corner, I said, bringing my focus back to the terrified man across the table. You thought I would cry and beg and ultimately sign my genius over to a mediocre man just to keep my childhood bedroom and my family's approval. But you severely underestimated me, Connor. You all did. I did not shed a single tear that night. I calmly closed my laptop, walked upstairs, and packed exactly one suitcase. But before I walked out the front door, I sat on the edge of my bed and opened my administrative terminal. I encrypted every single one of my primary hard drives with military-grade security. I wiped the cloud servers completely clean, erasing every trace of the true algorithm. And then I did something far more damaging. I left you with the localized beta environment. Connor's breath hitched audibly in the quiet dining room. Yes, Connor. I smiled, leaning in just a fraction closer, watching the sweat bead on his forehead. I left you with a buggy, unstable, fundamentally flawed beta version of the software. It looked beautiful on the front end. It had the sleek user interface I designed. But the core predictive architecture was essentially a house of cards waiting for a strong breeze. I walked out into the pouring rain, leaving you holding a ticking time bomb. I sat back in my chair, letting Xavier's warm, solid presence anchor me. Xavier's hand moved from the back of my chair to rest gently on my shoulder, a silent, heavy promise of absolute protection. While you and my family were busy popping champagne at country club engagement parties, I was working. While you were taking credit for a concept you did not even possess the intellect to comprehend, I was building my empire. I secured private venture capital. I rewrote the core architecture from the ground up, making it 10 times faster and infinitely more secure. I launched my fintech firm in absolute silence and swallowed the market whole while you were busy trying to figure out how to make my broken code function. The silence in the room was absolute. Even Kiara had stopped glaring at me. Her brow furrowed in deep confusion as she tried to understand the massive financial implications of what I was saying. She looked at her husband, expecting him to defend his honor, to laugh in my face and tell me I was lying. But Connor was completely incapable of speech. He looked as though he might actually vomit onto his expensive porcelain plate. Suddenly, a loud, booming laugh shattered the tension. Calvin was shaking his head, a wide, arrogant grin stretching across his face. He slapped his hand down on the table, dismissing my entire narrative with one aggressive gesture. "Is that supposed to scare us, Zora?" my father asked, his voice dripping with triumphant mockery. "You think leaving a few bugs in a beta version was some sort of masterstroke? You always were too arrogant for your own good. You severely underestimated your brother-in-law." Calvin looked proudly at Connor, clearly blind to the sheer panic radiating from the younger man. "Connor is a technological genius," Calvin boasted to the room at large, his voice booming with unearned pride. "It took him a few months, but he fixed your little bugs. He stabilized the system entirely on his own. His predictive software has been dominating the private market testing phase for the last year." My father leaned forward, his eyes flashing with raw, unadulterated greed. "Your little story means absolutely nothing, Zora. Connor's firm is launching its initial public offering tomorrow morning at the opening bell. The valuation is astronomical. By tomorrow afternoon, Connor and Kiara are going to be filthy rich. They are going to be sitting on a tech empire that makes your little coding hobby look like a lemonade stand. So you can take your dramatic stories and your new husband and get out of our sight before we have security escort you out." I did not break eye contact with my father. I let his arrogant laughter echo in the room until it naturally died out. He was so incredibly predictable. He was operating exactly on the script I had written for him. I reached out and unzipped the sleek black leather portfolio resting on the table. My fingers brushed against the thick, high-quality paper inside. I pulled out the second document. I smiled a cold, calculated smile that finally made the triumph falter in my father's eyes. I slid the document smoothly across the mahogany table, letting it come to rest right in front of Connor. Connor's hand trembled as his pale fingers brushed the thick parchment. He picked it up slowly, his eyes darting frantically to the bold black letters printed at the top of the page. It was a formal filing from the United States District Court. I watched the exact second his brain processed the words stamped beneath the federal seal. The remaining color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His hands began to shake so violently that the heavy legal paper rattled, the crisp, dry sound echoing loudly in the dead silence of the private dining room. "What is it?" Kiara demanded, her voice shrill with a sudden creeping anxiety. She reached out and snatched the document from his unresisting hands. She scanned the page, her dark eyes widening in horror as she caught snippets of the legal jargon. "A federal lawsuit. Intellectual property theft." "Connor, what is this? What is she talking about?" Connor could not answer her. His eyes were locked on me, wide and terrified, looking exactly like a man who had just realized the bridge he was standing on had been rigged with explosives for years. "Let me explain it to her, Connor," I offered, leaning back comfortably in my chair and crossing my legs. "Since you always struggled to grasp the actual mechanics of the software you claim to have invented." I turned my attention to my sister, who was staring at the legal filing as if it were written in an alien language. When my father so graciously evicted me from my own home to hand Connor my life's work, I knew exactly what kind of man I was dealing with. I knew Connor was a parasite. He possessed just enough superficial tech vocabulary to fool technologically illiterate investors like Calvin, but he lacked the fundamental coding ability to build a complex, predictive algorithm from scratch. He was a salesman pretending to be an engineer. So when I sat on the edge of my bed, encrypted my primary drives, and left him with that localized beta version, I did not just leave him with buggy software. I left him with a digital Trojan horse. Connor squeezed his eyes shut, a low, pathetic groan escaping his throat. Calvin frowned, his bushy eyebrows pulling together in deep confusion. "A Trojan horse." What are you babbling about, Zora? Calvin demanded, though his voice lacked its previous booming authority. It sounded strained, laced with a sudden suffocating doubt. I ignored my father, keeping my gaze fixed entirely on the man who had stolen my future, and tried to pass it off as his own brilliance. You see, Connor, real developers do not just write code. We protect it. Embedded deep within the foundational architecture of that beta version were proprietary digital watermarks. They were not surface-level tags that a mediocre debugger could spot and scrub away. They were woven directly into the core mathematical logic of the prediction engine. Every time your system runs a successful market simulation, it executes a specific sequence of logic that I copyrighted 3 years ago. Connor's breathing became ragged, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow bursts. You cannot prove that he choked out, his voice cracking under the strain. We rewrote the front end. We overhauled the entire user interface. We changed the operating parameters. It is completely different software now. I let out a soft, genuinely amused laugh. The sound sent a visible shiver down my mother's spine. Oh, Connor, did you really think changing the wallpaper on a stolen house makes you the legal owner of the property? You scrubbed the front end, yes. But you were too terrified of breaking the core predictive engine to touch the foundational math. Because you knew if you dismantled the engine, you would never be able to put it back together again. You built a shiny new dashboard over my architecture and called it innovation. I leaned forward, dropping the conversational tone, my voice turning to hardened steel. I also left seed trackers buried in the deepest layers of the data processing pipeline. For the past 2 years, every single time your revolutionary software ran a major simulation, it pinged a secure server that I control. I have a digital log of every test, every market prediction, every investor demonstration you have ever run using my stolen architecture. I have millions of lines of irrefutable court-admissible data, proving that your entire company is built on a stolen framework. The silence that followed was absolute suffocating terror. Xavier stood perfectly still beside me, a silent monument to the devastation I was unleashing. I could feel the heat of his approval, the quiet, terrifying strength of a man watching his wife burn her enemies to the ground without raising her voice. Calvin slammed his heavy hand on the table, rattling the crystal glasses, trying desperately to resurrect his crumbling reality. "This is bluffing," he roared, his face flushing a deep, dangerous purple. "This is a pathetic intimidation tactic. Even if you filed a lawsuit, it will take years to litigate. Connor's firm has the best corporate defense attorneys in Atlanta on retainer. They will bury this filing in so much red tape you will run out of money before you ever see the inside of a courtroom. The IPO is happening tomorrow morning, Zora. Millions of dollars are moving. The SEC has already cleared the paperwork. You cannot stop a moving train with a piece of paper." Calvin looked at Connor aggressively, trying to transfer his own blind confidence into the younger man. "Right, Connor. Tell her. Tell her your legal team will swat this away like a mosquito." Connor did not speak. He was staring blindly at the lawsuit, a single bead of sweat rolling down his pale temple. His hands were gripping the edge of the mahogany table so tightly his knuckles were stark white. He was a fraud, and in that moment, sitting under the crushing weight of his own theft, he finally knew that I knew exactly how to destroy him. I slowly turned my wrist, pushing back the cuff of my emerald green blazer to glance at the delicate face of my watch. The gold hands caught the light of the crystal chandelier overhead. "You are right about one thing, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through his bluster with razor-sharp precision. Federal intellectual property litigation is a slow, grinding process. It takes months, sometimes years, to reach a settlement or a verdict. And a standard lawsuit alone would not be enough to stop an initial public offering of this magnitude. Calvin sneered, a desperate, ugly sound. "Exactly. So take your little papers and get out." "But my father," I continued, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "You seem to have forgotten who I am married to. I did not just file a standard lawsuit. I filed for an emergency federal injunction against your firm, Connor. And when my husband's legal team, a team that literally dictates federal corporate policy in 3 different states, presents irrefutable digital tracking evidence of mass corporate theft to a federal judge, things tend to move remarkably fast. I tapped the face of my watch with one manicured finger. The distinct, crisp sound echoed in the quiet room. As of exactly 10 minutes ago, a United States federal judge signed that injunction. The order has already been digitally served to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the New York Stock Exchange, and your primary underwriting banks. Connor let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking uncontrollably. Kiara was frozen, her mouth open in a silent scream, staring at her husband as if he had just turned to ash in front of her. Her billion-dollar future had just evaporated into thin air. Your initial public offering is dead, Connor. I stated the finality of the words, driving a stake directly through the heart of their stolen empire. Your company's assets are completely frozen. Your servers are legally mandated to shut down pending federal inspection. You cannot trade a single share, you cannot access your corporate capital, and by tomorrow morning, every major tech publication in the country will have the full unredacted details of this lawsuit. Your company is paralyzed. Your reputation is permanently destroyed. You have absolutely nothing. The private dining room felt like a tomb. My mother sat paralyzed, her eyes darting frantically between my unbothered expression and Connor's total collapse. My father's jaw was slack, the arrogant bluster completely stripped away, leaving only a hollow, aging man staring at the absolute destruction of his legacy. I had taken the very weapon they used to destroy me. Their greed, their arrogance, their belief that I was nothing, and I had forged it into the blade that just severed their entire future. The crisp white document lay on the mahogany table exactly where I had pushed it. Connor stared at the federal seal as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. The complete and total paralysis of his vocal cords was the most beautiful silence I had ever experienced. The reality of the federal injunction was a physical weight in the room, crushing the last remnants of his arrogant facade. Kiara leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the bold black lettering at the top of the page. It took her brain a few agonizing seconds to process the legal terminology, but when she reached the section detailing the immediate asset freeze and the suspension of the initial public offering, her entire body went rigid. The billion-dollar future she had been spending in her head for the last 6 months vanished into thin air. She did not just stand up, she erupted. Kiara shoved herself away from the table with so much violence that her heavy wooden dining chair tipped backward and crashed loudly onto the thick carpet. The sound was like a gunshot in the private suite. She slapped her hands flat onto the polished mahogany, leaning across the expensive crystal and fine china, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You are making this up!" Kiara screamed, her voice breaking on the final word. The shrill sound scraped against the elegant velvet walls of the room. "You printed this off the internet. You are just a pathetic, jealous liar, Zora. You cannot stand the fact that Connor chose me. You cannot stand that he realized you were nothing but a cold, unfeeling machine who cares more about a computer screen than she does about a relationship." She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, her diamond engagement ring catching the light. It was the same ring that was supposed to be mine, a glaring reminder of everything they had stolen. "You have been obsessed with ruining my marriage since the day he left you," Kiara yelled, her chest heaving as she struggled for breath. "You are a bitter, broke spinster who has absolutely nothing to her name. You are trying to sabotage our lives out of pure spite because no man would ever actually want you. You are nothing. You hear me. You are nothing." I did not move. I did not blink. I sat perfectly still in my chair, absorbing the frantic, desperate heat of her tantrum. For my entire life, Kiara's explosive outbursts had been the governing force of our household. Whenever she screamed, everyone else bent to her will just to keep the peace. But sitting here now, watching her unravel, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical pity. Yvonne saw the disaster unfolding. My mother is a woman who values social decorum and the appearance of elite control above all else. Having her golden child shrieking like a banshee in a luxury restaurant in front of a venture capital billionaire was her worst nightmare. She needed to assert dominance. She needed to immediately rewrite the narrative before Xavier realized he had married into a family of thieves. Yvonne stood up gracefully, smoothing the front of her designer dress. She stepped around the table and placed a firm, soothing hand on Kiara's trembling shoulder, pulling her slightly back. Then my mother turned her calculating gaze toward Xavier, completely ignoring my existence. She adopted a tone of dripping, condescending maternal concern, a voice she had weaponized against me for 3 decades. "Xavier, please, you must forgive my youngest daughter," Yvonne said, offering him a tight, apologetic smile. "She is just so passionate about her husband and their successful marriage. It is terribly upsetting for her to see her sister behave this way." Yvonne took a step closer to Xavier, angling her body as if she were inviting him into an exclusive club of reasonable, sane people. She lowered her voice, attempting to sound intimately confiding. "I am so terribly sorry you have been dragged into this, Xavier. I can only imagine the wild stories Zora has told you to secure your attention, but as a mother it breaks my heart to tell you the truth about her. I watched my mother slide effortlessly into the role she played best, the long-suffering matriarch burdened with a defective child. I knew exactly what was coming. I had survived this specific brand of psychological warfare my entire life. Zora is deeply unwell." Yvonne continued, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "She has always lived in a fantasy world. When Connor broke off their engagement because he realized she lacked the warmth to be a true partner, she simply snapped. She became completely delusional." My mother shook her head, letting out a heavy manufactured sigh. "She is a pathological liar, Xavier. She makes up these grand, elaborate fantasies about writing software and building companies because her actual reality is so completely pathetic. She is a bitter spinster, making up lawsuits and imaginary corporations just to get attention. She forged these documents today just to create drama and ruin a beautiful family brunch." Yvonne reached out, placing her hand dramatically over her heart. "I beg of you, Xavier, do not listen to this crazy woman. She will drag your reputation through the mud. She targets powerful men like you to validate her delusions of grandeur. She needs serious psychiatric help, not a husband. Please, you are a smart, successful man. Do not let her manipulate you any further. Walk away from this table before she damages your incredible legacy." The absolute sheer audacity of her gaslighting was breathtaking. She was attempting to erase my entire corporate empire, my intellectual property, and my reality right in front of my face. She was trying to convince my husband that I was a hysterical, mentally unstable fraud, so they could walk away with the software I built from scratch. I looked up at Xavier. I expected to see a flicker of surprise or perhaps a shadow of doubt. Most men presented with a weeping mother and a screaming sister would at least hesitate. They would ask questions. They would demand clarification. But Xavier was not most men. He did not raise his voice. He did not puff out his chest or start shouting to defend my honor. He simply looked at my mother with a gaze so devoid of human warmth it could have frozen the champagne in her glass. He looked at Yvonne, not as a grieving mother, but as a mildly annoying obstacle in a business transaction. He slowly withdrew his hand from the back of my chair. Without taking his eyes off my mother's suddenly pale face, he reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored charcoal suit jacket. He moved with that same quiet, lethal grace, withdrawing a sleek silver tablet. "You speak of fantasies," Yvonne, Xavier said, his deep baritone cutting through the stagnant air of the dining room with absolute finality. "You speak of delusions and pathological lies. But in my line of work, we do not deal in maternal opinions or hysterical accusations. We deal in hard, verifiable facts." Xavier stepped forward and placed the tablet flat on the mahogany table right beside the federal injunction. He tapped the glowing screen, once opening an encrypted media player. "Let us see how well your narrative holds up to the truth," Xavier said. He pressed play on a high-definition audio file. The digital audio file began to play, filling the dead silence of the private dining room with perfect, crisp clarity. The acoustics in the restaurant were designed to keep conversations intimate, but Xavier had the volume turned up just enough so that every single syllable bounced off the heavy velvet curtains and struck my family directly in the chest. Yeah, hi, this is Connor Hayes, calling for the senior acquisition partners again, the voice on the recording began. It was unmistakably Connor. But it was not the arrogant, patronizing tone he had used to mock my coding hobby just 20 minutes ago. The voice echoing from the sleek silver tablet was frantic, breathless, and trembling with suppressed panic. It was the sound of a man standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down at the jagged rocks. I know your firm officially passed on our last funding round, the recorded. Connor continued his words, rushing together in a desperate jumble. But I am begging you to reconsider. I need to speak directly with Mr. Pierce. The situation has escalated. We need an emergency backdoor bridge loan. I am looking for 10 million, but I can make 8 work. We will offer preferred equity at a massive discount prior to the initial public offering. At the table, the real Connor physically shrank. He folded in on himself, pulling his arms tight across his chest, as if trying to hide from his own pathetic begging. He squeezed his eyes shut, but he could not block out the sound of his own humiliation playing on a loop. Listen, you have to understand the audio file, hissed Connor, drawing a ragged breath on the recording. The core architecture is failing. The predictive engine is throwing fatal errors every single time we try to scale the data. It is a complete disaster. We are burning through our remaining cash runway, paying freelance developers triple their normal rate to patch the holes, but nothing is holding the infrastructure together. It keeps collapsing. If the federal auditors look too closely at the back end before the opening bell rings tomorrow, we are completely dead. I am facing absolute personal bankruptcy here. My father-in-law leveraged a massive amount of his own capital into this launch, and if this fails, it takes us all down. Please, I just need a lifeline. Just a few million to keep the lights on until the public offering clears, please. Xavier tapped the screen, cutting the audio off abruptly. The sudden quiet that followed was infinitely heavier than the noise. I watched my father's face transition from a deep, angry purple to a terrifying, translucent gray. Calvin had just heard the absolute confirmation that his golden boy, his chosen successor, the man he had thrown his own daughter away for, had secretly gambled their entire financial future on a failing product. Calvin had poured his own money into Connor's firm, expecting a massive payout from the public offering. Instead, he had just learned he was financially strapped to a sinking ship that had been taking on water for months. Xavier slid the tablet smoothly back into the inner pocket of his bespoke jacket. You called my private acquisitions office 14 times in the last 3 weeks. Connor Xavier said, his voice entirely conversational, devoid of any anger. You left voicemails with my secretaries, my junior partners, and my personal assistant. You begged like a starving dog in an alleyway. You were so desperate for a cash infusion you offered to sell 30% of your company for pennies on the dollar to a man you had never even met. Xavier leaned forward, slightly resting his knuckles on the table. You spent weeks pleading with a faceless billionaire to bail you out. What you lacked the basic intelligence to realize was that you were leaving those pathetic, desperate voicemails for my husband. Connor let out a miserable, strangled sound. He could not look at me. He could not look at Xavier. He just stared at his own shaking hands resting on the white tablecloth. You really thought you were the smartest man in the room? I said, my voice a cold, steady current dragging them all under. You actually convinced yourself you could take my brilliant architecture duct tape, a flashy new interface over it, and fool the entire financial sector. But you could not even maintain the code you stole. You bled your company dry trying to fix problems you did not even have the vocabulary to understand. You were bankrupting yourself while simultaneously sitting at family dinners bragging about your tech empire. Yvonne was completely paralyzed. The woman who had just loudly called me a delusional, pathological liar was now staring at her beloved son-in-law as if he were carrying a highly contagious disease. Her jaw hung open, her mind entirely incapable of processing the reality that she had backed the wrong horse. She had actively participated in stealing my wedding gown and my grandmother's ring for a man who was secretly begging for loose change just to keep up appearances. My father gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. He turned slowly, his neck looking stiff and painful, to face Connor. Calvin's voice was a low, dangerous growl when he finally managed to force the words past his lips. "Is it true?" Calvin demanded, ignoring me entirely and focusing all his rage on Connor. "Did you leverage my capital into a failing platform? Are we broke? Tell me right now before I strangle you with my bare hands. Are we broke?" Connor did not answer. He just squeezed his eyes tighter, a single tear leaking out and tracking down his pale, sweating cheek. That silent, pathetic confirmation was the only answer my father needed. Calvin slumped back into his chair, the life completely leaving his eyes, as he realized his entire legacy, his carefully hoarded wealth, was tied up in a fraudulent company that was now frozen by a federal court order. But the most spectacular reaction belonged to my sister. Kiara had stopped screaming. The shrill defensive fury that had possessed her just moments ago was entirely gone. She stood frozen beside her tipped-over chair, her expensive designer brunch outfit suddenly looking absurdly out of place on a woman who was technically married to a bankrupt fraud. She looked down at the massive vintage diamond glittering on her left hand. It was a flawless platinum setting that represented stability, wealth, and generations of promised security. But as she stared at it, the truth finally penetrated her thick, impenetrable layer of narcissism. The ring meant nothing. The massive house they lived in, the luxury cars they drove, the lavish vacations my mother bragged about, it was all a house of cards financed by debt and desperation. Kiara slowly turned her head, her dark eyes wide and hollow, locked onto the pathetic, sweating form of the man she had stolen from me. She looked at Connor not with love, not with partnership, but with absolute raw revulsion. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had spent 2 entire years gloating over her stolen victory. She had worn my dress. She had taken my ring. She had spent every family gathering making sure I knew she had won the grand prize. But she had not won a prize at all. She had won a con artist. The incredibly successful man she had built her entire identity around was completely, absolutely broke. Kiara stared at the sweating, trembling man beside her as if he had just morphed into a grotesque monster right before her eyes. The heavy silence of the private dining room was broken only by the ragged sound of Connor trying to draw breath into his panicked lungs. He reached out a clammy hand toward his wife, his fingers brushing the pristine silk of her designer sleeve. "Kiara, do not look at me like that," Connor stammered, his voice cracking, pitching an octave higher than normal. "It is just a temporary cash flow issue. Every major startup goes through this phase. It is a hurdle, just a small hurdle. Once the IPO clears tomorrow, everything will be fine. We will have the capital to fix the architecture. I swear to you, Kiara, I have it completely under control." "Do not touch me!" Kiara hissed, recoiling so violently she slammed her shoulder against the velvet wall. Her voice was pure venom, devoid of any of the adoring warmth she had projected all morning. "You lied to me. You sat in our custom-built house and let me plan a lifestyle based on a billion-dollar valuation you knew was completely fake. You let me wear my sister's ring and parade around the country club playing the role of the visionary founder's wife while you were secretly begging strangers for money." "Baby, please," Connor pleaded, his eyes darting frantically around the room looking for a single sympathetic face. "You know the market. You know how these things fluctuate. I just need a little more time." "You are not a visionary." Kiara spat, her upper lip curling in disgust. "You are a fraud. You stole her code because you are too stupid to write your own. You are bankrupt. You are absolutely worthless to me." Connor physically recoiled as if she had slapped him. Desperate, he turned his wide, panicked eyes toward my mother. "Yvonne, my mother-in-law. Please, you have to understand. I was trying to protect the family asset." Yvonne did not even grace him with a response. She slowly and deliberately turned her back to him, picking up her linen napkin and dabbing at the condensation on her water glass, as if Connor simply did not exist. The swiftness with which she discarded him was breathtaking. 10 minutes ago, he was the son she always wanted. Now he was a financial liability, a social embarrassment she was already mentally erasing from her holiday card list. Connor's last shred of hope rested on my father. He looked across the mahogany table at the man who had bankrolled his stolen venture. Calvin, tell them, Connor begged, his voice breaking completely. You know the potential here. We just need to weather this storm. If we can just get past the injunction, if we can just negotiate a settlement with Zora, we can save the company. We can save your investment. I watched my father carefully. I knew the exact mathematical equation running through Calvin's brain. He was calculating risk versus reward. He was weighing the absolute destruction of Connor's firm against the presence of a verified venture capital billionaire standing right in front of him. I saw the exact second my father decided to sever the infected limb to save himself. Calvin stood up. He did not look at Connor. He straightened his expensive suit jacket, adjusted his silk tie, and rolled his shoulders back, attempting to resurrect the commanding presence he had walked into the room with. He plastered a grave, serious expression on his face, the look of a seasoned businessman, making a tough but necessary call. He turned his back on the younger man and looked directly at my husband. Xavier Calvin began, his voice dropping back into its deep, authoritative rumble. I must apologize. It appears I have been entirely deceived by a con artist. Connor let out a choked gasp, staring at his father-in-law in absolute shock. Calvin, you cannot be serious. Keep your mouth shut, you pathetic little thief, Calvin snapped, without even turning his head to look at him. You have embarrassed this family for the last time. You are dead weight, and I am cutting you loose right here and now. My father turned his attention back to Xavier, offering a smooth, practiced smile that completely ignored the fact that he had just verbally abused my husband and myself 10 minutes prior. In Calvin's world, money washed away all sins, and Xavier had more money than God. I am a pragmatic man, Xavier Calvin said, spreading his hands in a gesture of open transparency. I recognize a bad investment when I see one. Connor is a liability. He will be dealt with. My lawyers will have Kiara's marriage annulled by the end of the week. He will be stripped of every asset attached to my family name. Calvin took a step closer to Xavier, leaning over the table slightly. But let us talk about real business. Let us talk about tangible assets. You are a venture capitalist. You understand the value of concrete, reliable infrastructure. This software nonsense, this digital gambling, it is a young man's foolish game. It is volatile. But my logistics company is the bedrock of the regional supply chain. We have warehouses, a massive fleet of transport vehicles, and established municipal contracts. I sat back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest, absolutely mesmerized by the sheer shameless audacity of the man who had raised me. He was actively trying to pitch his own son-in-law for an investment immediately after having his previous fraudulent investment exposed. He was completely bypassing me once again, attempting to speak man to the billionaire as if I were just a pretty accessory sitting at the table. We have hit a slight plateau in our quarterly growth. Calvin continued, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of a well-rehearsed elevator pitch. We need an infusion of capital to scale operations and expand our fleet across the eastern seaboard. I am prepared to offer you a highly favorable equity position, Xavier. A guaranteed board seat. We cut the dead weight out of the family today, and we build a real, profitable partnership moving forward. You bring the capital, and I will give you a piece of a proven legacy. The silence hung in the room for exactly 2 seconds before I simply could not contain it anymore. I laughed. It was not a polite chuckle. It was a loud, genuine, echoing laugh that bounced off the crystal chandeliers and rolled across the mahogany table. It was the sound of a decade of oppression finally shattering. Calvin stopped his pitch, mid-sentence, glaring down at me, his face flushing with immediate anger. Do you find corporate expansion amusing, Zora? He demanded, his tone sharp and condescending. I am conducting business with your husband. You are not conducting business with anyone. Dad? I said, still chuckling as I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. You are standing in the middle of a burning building trying to sell the ashes. I shook my head, looking at him with a mixture of amusement and profound pity. You really do not understand what I built, do you? You think my fintech architecture is just some digital gambling application that predicts stock prices. You think it just analyzes market trends so people like you can get rich quickly. I steepled my fingers together, resting my chin on them. When I rebuilt the core algorithm after Connor stole the broken beta version, I vastly expanded its processing capabilities. It does not just predict the market, Dad. It analyzes institutional compliance. It maps out corporate financial ecosystems, looking for anomalies, discrepancies, and hidden data flows. It is a forensic accounting engine designed to flag irregularities for major financial institutions. Calvin's confident posture faltered. He blinked, his thick eyebrows drawing together. What does that have to do with my logistics firm? Everything. I smiled, my voice dropping to a surgical whisper. Because last week I ran a beta test of our new compliance tracking module, using regional transport companies as the dataset. Your logistics firm was included in the sweep. The color began to drain from Calvin's face, matching the ashen hue of his disgraced son-in-law. My software is incredibly thorough, Dad. I continued outlining the destruction of his empire with perfect clarity. It mapped your entire corporate structure, it traced the routing of your municipal contracts, and it found the shell companies you set up in the Cayman Islands. It found the massive discrepancies between your reported revenue and your actual operating costs. I watched my father's hands begin to tremble. The invincible patriarch was finally breaking. My algorithm flagged your highly proven legacy company for massive systematic corporate tax fraud, I said, ensuring every syllable landed with devastating impact. It generated a comprehensive 200-page report detailing exactly how you have been hiding millions of dollars from the federal government for the last 7 years. And because our software is currently partnered with federal regulatory agencies for compliance testing, that report was automatically forwarded to the Internal Revenue Service Investigation Division 3 days ago. Calvin opened his mouth to speak, but he had no breath left. There is no investment coming, Dad, I said softly, leaning back in my chair as Xavier rested his hand on my shoulder once again. You are not scaling your fleet. You are going to federal prison. The dust from the spectacular explosion at the restaurant had finally settled into a quiet, heavily fortified peace. 3 days had passed since I systematically dismantled my family's fraudulent empire over Sunday brunch. I was currently standing in the grand foyer of the private estate Xavier and I shared in the exclusive hills of Buckhead. The property was a modern fortress of white limestone and bulletproof glass, surrounded by acres of manicured grounds, and protected by a state-of-the-art perimeter security system. I was pouring myself a cup of dark roast coffee, finally allowing my shoulders to drop and exhale the decades of tension I had carried when the perimeter alarm chimed. It sent a harsh, sharp warning through the smart home system, echoing off the vaulted ceilings. I set my coffee mug down on the marble kitchen island and tapped the central control console. The high-definition live feed from the front gates flared to life on the screen. What I saw made my blood run cold for a fraction of a second before profound annoyance completely replaced my surprise. A heavy delivery truck from a local organic grocer was slowly pulling through the massive wrought iron gates. Right on its bumper, driving so aggressively close that the hood ornament nearly clipped the closing metal doors, was my father's black Mercedes sedan. They had deliberately tailgated the delivery driver to bypass the biometric security checkpoint at the guardhouse. It was a desperate, dangerous, and incredibly arrogant maneuver. It was perfectly on brand for Calvin. I watched the camera feed in cold silence as the Mercedes screeched to a halt in the circular driveway. The car parked at a violent, jagged angle, right over the meticulously arranged cobblestones, narrowly missing a stone fountain. Calvin threw his door open before the engine even cut off. Yvonne scrambled out of the passenger side, her designer heels clicking frantically against the pavement. They did not look like the untouchable elite socialites of Atlanta anymore. They looked completely unhinged and hunted. My father's expensive silk tie was yanked loose, his bespoke suit jacket was deeply wrinkled, and his face carried a permanent gray sheen of panic. My mother's usually immaculate hair was windblown and erratic, her posture rigid with frantic energy. They stormed up the wide limestone steps toward my front entrance. A second later, the heavy mahogany double doors began to rattle violently under the force of my father's fists. He was pounding on the solid wood with the sides of his hands, yelling my name, the sound muffled but unmistakable through the thick, soundproofed construction. Xavier walked calmly into the foyer, his dark eyes instantly locking onto the security monitor. He was dressed in a simple black turtleneck and slacks, projecting a quiet, lethal authority. He immediately reached for his phone to summon our private armed security detail, but I intercepted his arm, placing a gentle hand over his wrist. "I will handle this," I told him, keeping my voice perfectly level. "They came looking for the terrified little girl they used to control. I need to show them exactly who owns this estate." Xavier nodded once his jaw set. He stepped back, offering me the floor, a silent promise that he was ready to intervene the second I needed him, but respecting my right to end this war myself. I walked to the entrance, unlocked the steel deadbolt, and pulled the heavy mahogany door open. I stepped out onto the expansive covered porch, but I did not step aside. I stood directly in the center of the doorway, physically blocking their entry, crossing my arms over my cashmere sweater. Calvin nearly stumbled forward as the door swung inward, catching his balance just before he invaded my personal space. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as if he had just sprinted up a mountain. Yvonne stood right behind him, wringing her hands together in a display of highly manufactured maternal distress. "Call it off," Calvin demanded. His voice was a ragged, desperate bark that carried across the quiet, sprawling estate. "Call it all off right now, Zora." I just stared at him, completely unbothered, letting the cool morning breeze drift between us. "Call what off, Dad?" I asked, knowing exactly what he meant but forcing him to say the words out loud. "Do not play games with me," he roared, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "The intellectual property lawsuit against Connor. The federal injunction. You need to call your high-priced lawyers and drop it today. And that completely fabricated, malicious report you sent to the Internal Revenue Service about my logistics firm. You are going to retract it right now. You are going to call your federal contacts and tell them it was a glitch in your system, a terrible mistake made by a disgruntled employee. You are going to fix this mess." I tilted my head, studying the sheer, unadulterated panic sweating out of his pores. "You want me to commit federal perjury to cover up your massive corporate tax fraud," I summarized, keeping my tone strictly conversational. "And you want me to hand my proprietary software back to the mediocre man who stole it just so your golden daughter can maintain her country club membership." Yvonne pushed her way to the front, stepping in front of my father. Fake tears welled in her eyes, perfectly timed for maximum emotional manipulation. "Zora, please," she begged, her voice trembling with practiced theatrical emotion. "You are destroying this family. Do you have any idea what the last 3 days have been like for us? The media is circling our home like vultures. Connor's firm is in total receivership, and Kiara has not stopped crying since Sunday. Your father's logistics company is facing a massive government audit that is going to freeze our operational capital by the end of the week. We are going to lose everything we have built." She reached out, trying to grab my hands to force a physical connection, but I took a calculated, icy step backward out of her reach. "We are your parents," Yvonne cried, her voice cracking as she leaned into her ultimate weapon. "We gave you life, Zora. We put a roof over your head. We clothed you and fed you and gave you every advantage in the world. You owe us. You cannot just discard your own flesh and blood over money and a foolish grudge. We are a family. We protect each other. You need to drop these ridiculous vendettas and help us survive this nightmare. You owe us your loyalty." I listened to her toxic manipulation, letting the words wash over me without absorbing a single drop of guilt. They truly believed the old programming would still work. They believed they could demand my absolute submission as payment for simply bringing me into the world. They wanted me to save them from the fires they had started with their own greed. I slowly reached behind me to the small marble console table, sitting just inside my foyer. I picked up the item I had explicitly prepared and placed there earlier this morning. It was a thick, heavy red folder. I stepped back out onto the porch and held the folder up. The bright crimson cover stood out sharply against the neutral, calming tones of my house. I owe you nothing, I stated, my voice echoing across the porch with absolute immovable authority. I do not owe you my genius, my money, or my silence. I certainly do not owe you my protection. Calvin's eyes darted to the folder. His aggressive bravado faltered, instantly replaced by a fresh, suffocating wave of fear. What is that? He demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh, terrified whisper. I smiled, tracing the edge of the red cardboard with my thumb. I owe you absolutely nothing, Dad, I repeated softly, letting the silence stretch for a perfect, agonizing second, especially after what my financial auditors uncovered yesterday. I flipped back the heavy crimson cover of the folder, letting the stiff cardboard rest flat against my forearm. Inside was a neatly organized stack of financial documents printed on crisp white paper, bearing the distinct watermark of a major national bank. The morning breeze caught the edges of the pages, causing them to flutter slightly in the tense silence of the porch. I pulled the top 3 pages loose from the metal clasp and held them out just far enough for my parents to see the bold black ink, but entirely out of their physical reach. What are you looking at, Dad? Is a commercial loan agreement, I said, my voice slicing through the crisp morning air like a newly sharpened blade. It is dated exactly 1 week after you threw me out of your house into the freezing rain. It is a revolving line of credit for exactly $500,000, originated by Capital Trust and dispersed directly to Kiara's luxury boutique holding company. Calvin squinted at the documents, his thick brow furrowing in deep confusion. He shook his head slowly, his eyes darting from the bank logo to my face. I do not understand, Calvin muttered, his voice raspy and stripped of all its former aggressive power. Kiara's boutique is fully self-sustaining, and even if she needed a bridge loan, she would have come to me. I handle all the commercial financing for the family. No, Dad, you handle all the commercial financing for your logistics company, I corrected him, enjoying the absolute bewilderment painted across his aging features. A logistics company that, as we established yesterday, is heavily leveraged and actively hiding cash from the federal government. Your personal credit was likely maxed out or tied up in Connor's fraudulent software venture. You did not have the liquid capital or the pristine credit score required to secure a $500,000 unsecured loan for a vanity retail project. I shifted my gaze from my broken father to my mother. Yvonne was staring at the papers in my hand as if they were soaked in lethal poison. The manufactured tears that had been welling in her eyes just moments ago completely vanished. Her breathing turned shallow and rapid. You thought you were so incredibly clever, Mom, I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her. You thought because I walked out of that house with a single suitcase and a broken heart that I was effectively erased from the financial world. You assumed I would be too busy struggling to pay rent in some rundown studio apartment to ever run a comprehensive background credit check on my own social security number. You believed I was a pathetic, helpless failure who would never have the resources or the legal representation to fight you, even if I did somehow discover your little secret. Yvonne swallowed hard, her throat clicking audibly in the quiet space between us. She took a step backward, bumping directly into Calvin's chest. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the primary signature line at the bottom of the second page. Right there in blue ink is my name, listed as the primary guarantor for a $500,000 commercial loan. I leaned in close enough to smell the expensive floral perfume radiating from her rigid body. You forged my signature, Yvonne. You bound my legal identity and my financial future to a failing retail venture because your golden child was bleeding cash, and you could not bear the social embarrassment of letting her overpriced vanity boutique go bankrupt. Calvin physically recoiled from his wife, looking at Yvonne as if a stranger had suddenly possessed her body. You did what? Calvin barked, his voice cracking with shock. Yvonne, tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not commit bank fraud. She cannot tell you that, Dad. Because the evidence is sitting right here in my hand, I said smoothly, answering for her. She used my old financial records from when I lived under your roof. She used my social security number, and she bribed that corrupt notary public you play tennis with to stamp the documents without me being physically present in the room. She orchestrated a massive federal crime just to keep Kiara in designer shoes. Xavier remained perfectly still in the doorway behind me, a silent, towering monument to the devastating power I now wielded. I could feel the heat of his approval radiating through the cold air. "Did you honestly believe this would stay buried forever, Mom?" I asked, tilting my head and studying her paralyzed face. When my fintech firm scaled to an international level, and when Xavier and I merged our personal holding companies, my private financial management team had to conduct a comprehensive sweep of my entire economic history. They scrubbed every single database. Imagine my absolute shock when my lead forensic accountant walked into my office yesterday morning and asked me why I was personally guaranteeing a massive commercial loan for a boutique I have never set foot in. I let the red folder drop back to my side, the sound of the thick paper slapping against my thigh echoing loudly. "This is not just a petty family squabble anymore," I stated, my tone devoid of any emotion. "This is aggravated identity theft. This is federal wire fraud. This is a crime that carries a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. You trespassed on my property today to demand that I save this family from ruin. You demanded loyalty. You claimed I owed you for giving me life. But the only thing you actually gave me was a stolen identity and $500,000 of fraudulent debt." Calvin looked like he was going to pass out. He grabbed his chest, his face turning an alarming shade of gray as the realization hit him. His company was being investigated by the Internal Revenue Service. His son-in-law was a bankrupt fraud facing intellectual property litigation. And his wife was a documented felon who had just handed a venture capital billionaire all the proof needed to put her behind bars. The mighty empire he had ruled with an iron fist had completely burned to the ground in less than 72 hours. I waited for my mother to break. I waited for the classic tears of remorse, for the desperate apologies, for the begging and pleading. I expected her to drop to her knees and weep about how she was only trying to help her daughter, how she made a terrible mistake in a moment of maternal panic. But Yvonne did not cry. Instead, the paralyzing fear that had gripped her face suddenly melted away. Her rigid posture straightened. She lifted her chin, tilting her head back to look down her nose at me. The carefully constructed mask of the loving, distressed mother completely shattered, revealing the toxic, entitled monster lurking underneath. Her face twisted into a vicious, ugly sneer. "I do not owe you an apology, Zora," my mother hissed, her voice dripping with pure, unadulterated malice. "You lived under my roof for 22 years. You ate the food I provided. You wore the clothes I bought. That pristine credit score you are so incredibly proud of only existed because we paid your bills and funded your entire existence." Yvonne took a step forward, her eyes flashing with a terrifying, delusional self-righteousness. "I gave birth to you. Your name belongs to me. If your sister needed capital to secure her business, then it was your duty as a member of this family to provide it. You should be honored that I found a use for you. You were a miserable, ungrateful burden who did nothing but sit in her room staring at a computer screen while Kiara actually made something of herself in society." She pointed a rigid finger at the red folder in my hand. "You are going to take those papers, and you are going to destroy them," Yvonne commanded, her voice echoing with the same toxic authority she had used to terrorize me my entire childhood. "You are going to pay off that loan with your new billionaire husband's money, and you are going to fix this family, because without us you are nothing but an ugly, socially inept failure who got lucky." Yvonne stood there panting lightly, her chest heaving as she let the venomous echo of her own words settle over the porch. She expected me to crumble. She expected the decades of psychological conditioning to suddenly activate, forcing me to lower my eyes, apologize for my own success, and blindly obey my mother. I just stared at her. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. Xavier shifted slightly behind me in the foyer, the faint rustle of his expensive clothing the only sound in the tense morning air. I could feel his protective anger radiating outward, but he kept his promise to let me handle my own battles. When the tears of submission did not come, Yvonne's face morphed again. The sneer hardened into a mask of pure, calculated ruthlessness. She took another step forward, invading my personal space, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial, dangerous hiss. She realized the Maternal Authority Act had failed completely. She realized the guilt trip was utterly useless against a daughter who had finally recognized her own worth. So she switched to the only language this family actually understood: extortion. "You are going to listen to me very carefully, Zora." Yvonne began, her eyes darting quickly to Xavier before locking back onto mine. "You have built a very nice, very fragile little house of cards here. You have your shiny new company and your billionaire husband. But reputation is everything in your world, is it not? What do you think the board of directors at those major financial institutions will do when they find out their lead compliance auditor is a mentally unstable, vindictive woman actively trying to destroy her own flesh and blood?" I crossed my arms, maintaining absolute stillness. "Are you threatening me, Mom?" "I am offering you a business arrangement," Yvonne countered, her voice laced with poison. "Because if you do not do exactly what I say, I am calling my contacts at the Atlanta Journal and every major business network on the Eastern Seaboard. I will sit in front of the cameras and I will weep. I will tell the entire world how my poor, estranged daughter suffered a severe psychological break. I will tell them you are deeply unhinged, a pathological liar who completely fabricated a tax fraud narrative just to punish your father for a childhood grudge. I will say you forged these bank documents yourself in a desperate bid for attention." Calvin, sensing a shift in leverage, suddenly found his spine. He stepped up beside his wife, his chest puffing out as he slicked back his thinning hair. "The media loves a tragic family story," Zora Calvin added, his deep voice regaining its arrogant rumble. "And they love tearing down billionaires even more. We will paint Xavier as the ultimate corporate predator. We will say he preyed on a mentally fragile woman, manipulating you into stealing Connor's intellectual property to crush a young, rising entrepreneur. By the time my public relations team is done with you, Xavier's firm will be facing a massive public boycott, and your proprietary software will be viewed as the delusional scribblings of a madwoman." They were feeding off each other, building a twisted alternate reality where they were the victims and I was the villain. It was breathtaking in its audacity. They were standing on the threshold of my home, completely exposed, yet they still believed they held all the power. "We will drag your name through the mud until you are a laughingstock in the tech industry," Yvonne promised, her eyes wide and manic. "No bank will ever hire your firm again. No investor will ever trust your husband. You will be absolutely toxic." "And how exactly do I avoid this tragic fate?" I asked, my voice perfectly flat, betraying none of the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Yvonne nodded, her eyes flashing with triumphant malice, assuming she had finally cornered me. "Here are my terms. You will assume the $500,000 debt from Kiara's boutique and pay it off quietly through one of your shell companies. I know you have the liquid capital to make it disappear by noon. You will immediately contact your lawyers and drop the intellectual property lawsuit against Connor. You will sign a public statement verifying that Connor is the sole creator of that algorithm. And you will make whatever phone calls you need to make to bury this absurd IRS audit into your father's logistics firm." She crossed her arms, mirroring my posture, a smug smile stretching across her face. "You make the problems go away, Zora. You pay the debt, you drop the suit, you kill the audit. If you do that, we walk away. We will sign whatever non-disclosure agreements you want. We will never contact you again. You get to keep your perfect little life and play pretend billionaire. If you refuse, we burn your reputation and your husband's empire to the ground by 5 o'clock this evening." It was a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation. They were standing on the porch of a house they did not own, threatening a woman they did not know, trying to extort their way out of federal crimes they had absolutely committed. They were so blinded by their own arrogance, so utterly convinced of their own superiority, that they had completely forgotten who they were dealing with. I was not the quiet, compliant teenager who used to hide in her bedroom, avoiding their wrath. I was a forensic data engineer who built systems designed to trap criminals exactly like them. I let out a slow, steady breath. I did not argue. I did not scream. I did not try to reason with them or defend my sanity. I simply raised my right hand and extended a perfectly manicured index finger, pointing directly upward toward the sleek matte black fixtures, seamlessly integrated into the limestone pillars of the porch. Calvin and Yvonne both frowned their eyes instinctively following the direction of my finger. They stared at the small domed lenses tucked discreetly under the eaves of the portico. This entire estate is wired with military-grade high-definition audio and visual recording equipment, I said, my voice cutting through the morning air like ice. It is a closed-circuit system designed to protect highly classified federal compliance data. It does not just record video, Dad. It captures crystal-clear directional audio from 100 feet away. Yvonne's smug smile instantly vanished. The triumphant gleam in her eyes shattered, replaced by a sudden horrifying realization. Calvin's face drained of color for the second time that morning, his mouth dropping open in silent terror as he stared up at the blinking red light on the camera lens. "You did not just confess to felony bank fraud on my porch, Mom," I stated, leaning in so close I could see the sheer panic dilating her pupils. "You just explicitly laid out a premeditated, coordinated extortion plot. You just threatened to destroy a federal witness to manipulate an ongoing Internal Revenue Service investigation. That is Title 18, Section 1512 of the United States Code. Witness tampering and extortion." I lowered my hand, my expression hardening into stone. I watched the absolute devastation wash over the people who had made my childhood a living nightmare. They had walked right into the trap and handed me the padlock. "Smile for the federal investigators, Mom," I said, my voice ringing with finality. "They just recorded your entire extortion attempt." My mother's mouth opened and closed silently as the reality of the blinking red lens registered in her panicked brain. The vicious sneer she had just worn collapsed instantly into a mask of absolute horror. Calvin did not even bother to speak or attempt to salvage the situation. He grabbed his wife tightly by the upper arm and roughly pulled her backward, nearly dragging her down the limestone steps as they fled. I stood on the porch and watched them scramble into his improperly parked Mercedes. The tires shrieked against the cobblestones as Calvin slammed his foot on the accelerator, leaving nothing behind but the lingering scent of desperation and expensive floral perfume. I calmly walked back inside, retrieved the encrypted drive containing the highly incriminating porch footage, and handed it directly to my chief legal counsel. 48 hours later, the atmosphere inside my downtown corporate office was humming with lethal efficiency. My private suite occupied the entire top floor of a sleek glass skyscraper, offering a panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. It was a physical representation of the quiet, impenetrable control I had finally established over my own life. I was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, reviewing a stream of compliance data on a transparent digital tablet when my desk intercom chimed. It was Marcus, my lead litigation attorney. His voice was perfectly level, but carried a distinct note of professional satisfaction. "Zora," Marcus said smoothly over the intercom, "we have an unexpected guest in Conference Room B. Connor Hayes reached out to us privately this morning. His personal defense attorney officially dropped him yesterday due to a severe lack of retainer funds. He drove here himself and is currently sitting at our table sweating profusely and begging to offer a recorded deposition. He wants to make a deal." I did not go into the conference room. I had absolutely no desire to breathe the same recycled air as the man who had actively participated in my emotional destruction. Instead, I walked down the carpeted hallway and entered the adjacent observation suite. The room was dark, illuminated only by the soft glow of the audio monitors and dominated by a massive pane of one-way mirror glass. I stood in the shadows and looked through the glass at the golden boy. Connor was completely unrecognizable from the arrogant, polished tech visionary who had sat at the brunch table just a few days prior. The expensive tailored suit was gone, replaced by a wrinkled, button-down shirt, holding prominent sweat stains under the arms. His face was pale, his hair was unwashed, and his hands shook so violently he could barely hold the plastic cup of water my legal team had provided. He was the portrait of a ruined man facing the absolute certainty of federal prison. Marcus sat across from him looking impeccably sharp. He pressed a button on the table activating the recording system. A small red light flared to life, signaling that every word Connor spoke was now official legal record. "State your name for the record," Marcus instructed, his voice clipped and entirely unsympathetic. Connor swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "Connor. David Hayes?" he stammered, his voice thin and reedy. "You requested this meeting, Mr. Hayes," Marcus continued. "You stated you had vital information regarding the ongoing intellectual property theft lawsuit and the federal bank fraud investigation concerning your mother-in-law, Yvonne. I will remind you that this firm makes no guarantees of immunity, but your cooperation will be noted. What do you want to offer us?" Connor did not even hesitate. The speed with which he decided to throw his entire family under the bus was breathtaking. He had no loyalty to Kiara. He had no respect for Yvonne. He was a cornered rat, perfectly willing to chew off his own limbs to escape the trap. "I will give you everything," Connor blurted out, leaning forward desperately. "I know I am facing jail time for the intellectual property theft. I know Zora's code was embedded in my architecture. But you have to understand the pressure I was under. Kiara was bleeding me dry. She demanded a lifestyle I could not afford, and Yvonne completely encouraged it. They drove me to do it, but I can give you something better than just a stolen algorithm. I can give you the entire conspiracy." Marcus raised a single eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "Yvonne forged the signature," Connor said, his words spilling out in a frantic rush. "2 years ago, when Kiara's luxury boutique was facing total bankruptcy, Yvonne came to me with the commercial loan documents. She needed $500,000 to keep the doors open and prevent a public social humiliation. She bragged to me about doing it. She told me she used Zora's old financial files from the house to steal her social security number. She said Zora was so mentally broken and completely destitute that she would never have the resources to run a credit check or hire a lawyer. Yvonne deliberately shackled Zora with a $500,000 debt just to maintain Kiara's country club facade. I saw her pay off the notary public. I can give you the exact dates and the routing numbers she used to hide the transaction." Through the glass, I watched Connor wipe a bead of sweat from his forehead. He was shaking harder now, but the adrenaline of his own betrayal was pushing him forward. "And the ring," Connor continued, his voice pitching higher in his desperate bid for mercy. "The vintage diamond ring and the custom wedding dress. You thought Zora just lost them in the chaos of moving out. She did not lose them. It was not a mistake. Kiara and Yvonne actively plotted to steal them." I felt a cold, heavy knot settle in the pit of my stomach as I listened to the confirmation of what I had always suspected. Kiara was furious that Zora was engaged before her. Connor babbled, his eyes darting frantically around the stark conference room. Kiara told her mother that Zora did not deserve the family heirlooms. She said an ugly failure like Zora had no right to wear that dress. So Yvonne bypassed the estate security. She gave Kiara the override codes to the family vault and the guest house where Zora kept her things. They deliberately took the dress and the ring to break Zora psychologically. They wanted to humiliate her so badly she would never return. Kiara has the ring reset right now on her finger. It is the exact same diamond. I will testify to all of it in federal court. I will swear to it under oath." Connor suddenly looked directly at the one-way glass. He could not see me, but his cowardice told him exactly where I was standing. "Please, Zora," Connor begged, his voice breaking into a pathetic whine as tears finally spilled over his pale cheeks. "I know you are watching. I know I was wrong, but I am giving you everything you need to lock them both away. I am giving you the bank fraud, the extortion, and the grand larceny. Just please grant me immunity on the intellectual property lawsuit. Do not send me to federal prison. Let me walk away, and you can have Kiara and Yvonne on a silver platter. I will testify against my own wife. Just let me go." I stared at the sniveling, crying man through the glass, feeling absolutely nothing but clinical disgust. There was no family here. There was just a collection of parasites perfectly willing to devour each other the second their host dried up. I turned away from the glass and pressed the intercom button connecting directly to Marcus's earpiece. "Take his full signed statement," I instructed, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any mercy. Get every single financial detail, every routing number, and every date. Once he signs the sworn affidavit, have security escort him out of my building. I released the intercom button and walked back down the silent hallway toward my private office. The puzzle was finally complete. I had the recorded extortion attempt from Calvin and Yvonne. I had the forensic audit proving Calvin's massive corporate tax fraud. And now, thanks to a terrified golden boy, I had a sworn deposition proving Yvonne's felony bank fraud and Kiara's grand larceny. I sat down at my massive mahogany desk and opened a secure communication channel to my legal team. The time for subtle maneuvering was over. It was time to drop the hammer. Draft a formal mandate. I typed, my fingers flying across the sleek keyboard. I want it printed on our heaviest corporate cardstock and hand-delivered via armed courier to Calvin's estate. Address it to Calvin, Yvonne, Kiara, and Connor. I paused, looking out at the sprawling city skyline below me. The mandate was simple, absolute, and completely non-negotiable. They were ordered to attend a final mandatory mediation session at the main conference room of Xavier's International Corporate Headquarters at exactly 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. There would be no lawyers present on their side. There would be no negotiations. The mandate carried a singular, devastating ultimatum. They will show up and face me tomorrow morning, or I am handing the entire compiled dossier to the federal authorities by noon. They can attend the meeting, or they can all go to federal prison. The elevator doors slid open with a soft metallic chime, revealing the top floor of Xavier's global headquarters. The space was a masterpiece of modern intimidation. It was not decorated with the heavy, antiquated mahogany and brass that my father favored in his own corporate offices. Instead, it was an expanse of brushed steel, polished obsidian, and seamless floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a dizzying, unobstructed panoramic view of the city far below. It was a physical manifestation of absolute, untouchable power. I sat at the head of the massive obsidian conference table. Xavier sat perfectly still beside me. We did not speak as the heavy glass doors to the boardroom swung open. My family walked in exactly as I expected them to. They walked in like they owned the building. Calvin entered first, leading the pack with his chest puffed out and his chin raised. He had clearly spent the entire morning convincing himself that my mandate was a sign of weakness. In his mind, I had panicked at the thought of his extortion threat and called this private meeting to desperately negotiate a quiet family settlement. He buttoned his suit jacket, projecting the false confidence of a patriarch ready to accept a tearful apology. Yvonne followed close behind him, her designer handbag clutched tightly in her manicured hands. She wore an expression of severe boredom, looking around the sleek boardroom with a manufactured sigh, as if she were a queen forced to attend a peasants' gathering. She genuinely believed her threat to destroy my reputation had terrified me into absolute submission. Kiara strutted in third. She wore a sharp, aggressive blazer and had my stolen vintage diamond prominently displayed on her left hand, catching the overhead lights. She crossed her arms immediately upon entering, staring at me with a look of pure, concentrated disdain. She thought she was here to witness my surrender. She thought she was going to watch Xavier pay off her husband's debts and write a massive check to save her boutique. And then there was Connor. He trailed behind them like a condemned ghost. While Calvin, Yvonne, and Kiara radiated toxic arrogance, Connor was physically vibrating with terror. His skin was the color of spoiled milk. He kept his eyes glued to the polished floor, refusing to look at me, refusing to look at Xavier, and terrifyingly unable to look at his own wife. Calvin glanced back at him and scoffed, clearly mistaking Connor's absolute panic for weakness regarding his failed startup. "Take a seat," Calvin commanded, waving a hand toward the row of empty ergonomic chairs on the opposite side of the long table. He did not wait for an invitation. He pulled out a chair and sat down immediately, placing his gold pen and leather notepad on the table, attempting to establish dominance over the room. "I am glad you finally saw reason, Zora." Calvin began, his voice echoing loudly off the glass walls. He leaned forward, adopting his best corporate negotiator persona. "I told your mother that once you had a night to calm down and process the reality of the situation, you would understand that family must be protected at all costs." We are prepared to accept your apology for the unwarranted hostility you showed us yesterday. We have drawn up a preliminary term sheet for the transfer of the boutique debt and the immediate dismissal of the intellectual property lawsuit. Yvonne took the seat beside him, smoothing her skirt. And we expect a full written retraction sent to the federal tax auditors before lunch. She added, her tone sharp and demanding. If you handle this efficiently and quietly, we are willing to put this entire unpleasant episode behind us. We will not speak to the media. I did not say a single word. I did not nod. I did not blink. I sat perfectly motionless, letting the sheer weight of my silence press down on them. Xavier remained equally silent, his dark, calculating gaze locked onto Calvin. The absolute lack of response began to make the air in the room feel incredibly thin. Calvin shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fake smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "Did you hear me, Zora?" he demanded, his voice rising slightly in pitch. "We are here to finalize the settlement. Do not waste my time playing power games." I slowly reached out and tapped a single illuminated button on the glass surface of the table. The room responded instantly. The automated solar shades hummed to life, sliding smoothly down the floor to ceiling windows and plunging the boardroom into shadows. Simultaneously, the three massive high-definition presentation screens mounted on the far wall flared to life. Calvin stopped talking. Yvonne frowned, clutching her purse. Kiara leaned forward, her eyes narrowing at the screens. Connor simply put his head in his hands and squeezed his eyes shut. The video feed filled the massive monitors in brilliant, unforgiving clarity. It was the recording from Conference Room B. My family sat paralyzed as they watched a massive, high-definition version of Connor appearing on the screens. He was sweating, trembling, and looking absolutely pathetic. The audio kicked in loud and perfectly equalized through the boardroom's hidden speakers. "I will give you everything," the recorded. Connor blurted out, his voice bouncing off the glass walls, filling the dark room with the sound of ultimate betrayal. "I know I am facing jail time for the intellectual property theft. I know Zora's code was embedded in my architecture. But you have to understand the pressure I was under. Kiara was bleeding me dry. She demanded a lifestyle I could not afford, and Yvonne completely encouraged it." At the table, Kiara let out a sharp, choked gasp. She whipped her head around to stare at her husband. Connor did not look up. He kept his face buried in his hands. On the screen, the confession continued, relentless and completely devastating. Yvonne forged the signature the recorded. Connor said, his words rushing out in a frantic, desperate plea for immunity. 2 years ago, when Kiara's luxury boutique was facing total bankruptcy, Yvonne came to me with the commercial loan documents. She needed $500,000 to keep the doors open. She bragged to me about doing it. She told me she used Zora's old financial files to steal her social security number. Yvonne deliberately shackled Zora with a $500,000 debt just to maintain Kiara's country club facade. I saw her pay off the notary public. I can give you the exact dates and the routing numbers she used to hide the transaction. Yvonne stopped breathing. Her rigid, haughty posture collapsed entirely. She shrank back into her leather chair, her eyes wide with absolute primal terror as she watched her own son-in-law explicitly detail her federal crimes to my legal team. Calvin stared at the screen, his jaw hanging open, the reality of the situation finally penetrating his thick skull. This was not a negotiation. This was an execution. But the recording was not finished. And the ring, the digital. Connor whined, tears streaming down his pale cheeks on the massive monitors. Kiara and Yvonne actively plotted to steal them. Kiara was furious that Zora was engaged before her. So Yvonne bypassed the estate's security. They deliberately took the dress and the ring to break Zora psychologically. Kiara has the ring reset right now on her finger. I will testify to all of it in federal court. I will swear to it under oath. The recorded Connor looked directly into the camera lens, begging for mercy. Just please grant me immunity on the intellectual property lawsuit. Let me walk away and you can have Kiara and Yvonne on a silver platter. I will testify against my own wife. Just let me go. I tapped the button on the console again. The screens instantly cut to black. The automated shades rolled silently back up, flooding the room with blinding morning sunlight. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. It was the sound of a toxic empire finally collapsing under the weight of its own deceit. No one moved. No one drew a breath. They were completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal they had just witnessed. Then, the silence shattered. The room exploded into absolute violent chaos. The silence shattered with a sound that resembled breaking glass. Kiara was the first to snap. She let out a high, piercing shriek that bounced off the steel walls and violently shoved her chair backward. She spun to face Connor, her perfectly manicured hands curling into claws. "You spineless, pathetic coward," Kiara screamed, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure rage. "You sold us out. You sold me out to save your own miserable skin." Connor scrambled backward in his ergonomic chair, holding his hands up defensively to shield his face. "I had to do it, Kiara," he stammered, his voice cracking under the sheer terror of her wrath. They had everything. Zora's forensic accountants found the code, they found the routing numbers. I was looking at 10 years in a federal penitentiary. I am not going to prison for your mother. I am not taking the fall for your vanity project. My vanity project. Kiara shrieked, her voice reaching a hysterical pitch. You were the one who went bankrupt. You were the one who stole her proprietary algorithm because you are completely incapable of having an original thought. You dragged us into this. She reached down to her left hand, her fingers frantically tearing at her own ring finger. Her chest heaved as she fought with the metal, ripping the stolen vintage diamond over her knuckle. Her skin turned red from the violent friction. She finally wrenched the ring free and reared her arm back, hurling the heavy diamond directly at her husband. The multi-carat stone struck Connor squarely in the cheekbone, leaving a bright red welt before ricocheting off his face and clattering loudly onto the polished obsidian table. It spun in a slow, glittering circle before coming to rest perfectly in the center of the boardroom. "You want to give it back to her?" Kiara roared, pointing a trembling finger at the diamond. "There it is. Give it to her." Connor rubbed his face, cowering away from his wife. "I made a deal, Kiara," he whined. "It was the only way out." Before Connor could utter another pathetic excuse, Yvonne unleashed a guttural, animalistic scream. The calculated, haughty matriarch completely evaporated, revealing the vicious predator beneath. She planted her hands on the heavy glass table and physically vaulted herself across it. She lunged directly at Connor, her designer skirt catching on the edge of her chair as she thrashed forward. Her hands swiped blindly at his collar, her long fingernails digging into the fabric of his shirt. "You ungrateful little rat!" Yvonne shrieked, spit flying from her lips as she struggled to reach his throat. "I committed a federal offense to save your pathetic household. I risked my entire pristine reputation to keep you from living in the gutter, and this is how you repay me. You walk into my daughter's office, and you hand me over to the feds like a piece of garbage." Connor yelped, trying to push his mother-in-law away as she leaned dangerously far over the wide boardroom table. "Mom, please," Connor begged, batting at her hands. The cameras recorded it all. They already knew. "I just confirmed it. I will kill you!" Yvonne screamed, her voice completely hoarse. "I will tear you apart before I let you send me to prison." Calvin had been staring blankly at the massive presentation screens, but Yvonne's violent outburst finally snapped him out of his shock. His face turned a deep, alarming shade of crimson. The veins in his thick neck bulged against his starched white collar. He slammed both of his massive fists down onto the table with a force that rattled the heavy glass and echoed like a gunshot. "Shut up!" Calvin bellowed. His voice possessed the booming, terrifying authority he had used to rule our household for decades. The sheer volume of it froze Yvonne mid-lunge. Kiara flinched, stepping backward away from her father. Calvin stood up, towering over the three of them, his chest heaving with uncontrollable fury. He looked at his wife, his daughter, and his son-in-law with a level of disgust so profound it was almost palpable. "You absolute useless idiots," Calvin roared, gesturing wildly at the three of them. "I spent 35 years building an empire. I built a legacy. I bought you the houses, I bought you the cars, I funded your entire ridiculous high society existence. And how do you repay me? You orchestrate a petty, vindictive high school scheme to steal a dress and a ring. You commit amateur hour bank fraud to fund a failing boutique. And you leave a massive digital trail leading straight back to my doorstep. Calvin pointed a rigid, thick finger directly at his wife. You forged commercial loan documents, Yvonne. Are you completely out of your mind? Do you understand what kind of scrutiny that brings? You practically invited the federal government to look into my finances. You are the reason the IRS is crawling all over my logistics company. You are the reason everything is burning to the ground. Do not you dare put this on me! Calvin, Yvonne spat back, scrambling back into her chair and smoothing her disheveled hair. You were already hiding cash offshore long before I signed that loan. Your company was a house of cards waiting to fall. You are just angry because you got caught. I got caught because I am surrounded by incompetent parasites, Calvin screamed, stepping toward her. You dragged this family into the mud because you could not stand the thought of Zora being successful. You let your petty jealousy destroy everything I built. I sat perfectly still at the head of the dark obsidian table. Xavier rested his hand gently over mine beneath the table, a silent anchor grounding me in reality. We did not speak. We did not intervene. I simply watched the people who had terrorized me my entire life actively cannibalize one another. There was absolutely no loyalty among them. There was no unconditional love. The moment the facade cracked, the moment real consequences appeared, they turned into a pack of starving wolves, tearing at each other's throats to save themselves. For 22 years, they had convinced me that I was the broken one. They had conditioned me to believe that I was the toxic element poisoning their perfect family dynamic. But watching Calvin disown his wife, watching Yvonne try to physically assault her son-in-law, watching Kiara hurl stolen diamonds at her husband's face, I realized the absolute truth. They were the poison. They had always been the poison. I was just the designated scapegoat they used to hide their rot from the rest of the world. Now that I was removed from the equation, they had no one left to blame but each other. The destruction was beautiful in its brutal honesty. Calvin turned his furious gaze to Connor, who was still cowering in his seat. "And you," Calvin spat, his lip curling in utter revulsion. "You march into enemy territory and sign a sworn confession handing over my wife to the federal authorities without even consulting my legal team. You are a weak, pathetic excuse for a man. I should have let you go bankrupt 3 years ago. I am cutting you off. You will not see a single dime of my money to fight this. You are completely on your own." "I am already on my own," Connor yelled back, finally finding a shred of desperate defiance. "You have no money left, Calvin. Zora's forensic team froze all your accounts. You are going down just like the rest of us. I will destroy you!" Calvin roared, lunging toward Connor. Right in the middle of their chaotic screaming match, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open with a soft hiss. The argument abruptly died down as the four of them snapped their heads toward the entrance. Marcus stepped into the room. My lead litigation attorney looked entirely unfazed by the screaming, the disheveled clothing, or the vintage diamond sitting abandoned in the center of the table. His tailored suit was immaculate. His expression was completely blank. He carried a single thick manila envelope in his right hand. He did not look at Yvonne. He did not look at Kiara or Connor. He walked with measured, deliberate steps straight down the length of the boardroom directly toward Calvin. Calvin straightened his jacket, trying to quickly recover some shred of his imposing corporate dignity. He lifted his chin, glaring at the attorney. "Whatever settlement offer you brought, we are not signing it under duress," Calvin stated, his voice trembling slightly with residual anger. "My legal team will review it." Marcus did not respond. He stopped perfectly parallel to Calvin. Without a single word, Marcus placed the heavy manila envelope onto the smooth glass surface and slid it firmly across the table. It came to a stop directly in front of my father. Calvin stared at the envelope for a long second. He glanced up at Marcus, then slowly reached out and flipped open the brass clasp. He pulled out the thick stack of legal documents printed on crisp white paper bearing the official seal of the state superior court. Calvin's eyes darted across the bold black text at the top of the first page. The remaining color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow shell of a man. His hands began to shake so violently that the thick paper rattled audibly in the quiet room. "What is it?" Yvonne demanded, her voice tight with renewed panic. "Calvin, what does it say?" Calvin could not speak. He just stared at the text, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. "It is an eviction notice," I stated, my voice calm, clear, and ringing with absolute finality. "Your offshore accounts are frozen, Dad. Your domestic assets are seized pending the federal tax audit. You defaulted on the estate's primary mortgage 3 days ago. My holding company purchased the debt from your bank this morning. You have exactly 48 hours to vacate the property before the county sheriff forcefully removes you. You are officially homeless." The screaming abruptly ceased. The sheer absolute finality of the word homeless hung in the air, snapping Calvin's jaw shut. He stared down at the thick stack of legal documents, his eyes frantically scanning the dense paragraphs and official court seals. His hands trembled so violently that the pages rustled against the heavy glass of the boardroom table. He flipped to the second page, then the third, his breathing growing increasingly ragged as the unassailable truth washed over him. The anger that had animated him just moments ago vanished entirely, replaced by a hollow, suffocating dread. I remained perfectly still in my chair, watching the exact moment the patriarch of the family broke. I did not feel a shred of pity. I felt only the cold, clinical satisfaction of a complex equation finally balancing out. "Let me explain exactly how this works, Dad," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the room. "You spent the last decade playing fast and loose with federal tax laws, siphoning cash from your logistics company into offshore accounts to fund Yvonne's country club lifestyle and Kiara's endless vanity projects. You thought you were invincible. But tax fraud creates a very specific type of financial vulnerability. When the IRS audit triggered the automatic default clauses in your primary commercial loans, your creditors panicked. They wanted to liquidate your assets immediately to recoup their losses before the federal government seized everything." Calvin looked up at me, his face entirely gray. He looked like an old broken man. "They were desperate to sell your debt for pennies on the dollar," I continued, leaning back in my chair and resting my hands on the obsidian table. "And as it turns out, my husband's holding company specializes in acquiring distressed assets. We bought your primary mortgages. We bought the commercial lease on Connor's office building. We bought the fraudulent loan Yvonne took out for Kiara's boutique. We bought all of it, Calvin." Yvonne let out a low, whimpering sound, sinking deeper into her leather chair. Kiara was completely frozen, her tear-streaked face locked in an expression of absolute horror. "I own the sprawling colonial estate you love so much," I stated, letting each word drop like a stone. "I own the building where Connor pretends to be a tech visionary. I hold the note on the $500,000 debt you tried to pin on my social security number. You do not own a single piece of property. You do not own your business. You possess absolutely nothing. The entire financial foundation of this family belongs to me." Calvin's shoulders slumped forward. The arrogant, powerful man who had belittled my achievements and mocked my career for 22 years was completely gone. He reached up with a shaking hand and wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. Tears welled in his eyes, spilling over his lower lashes and tracking down his flushed cheeks. "Zora, please," Calvin whispered, his voice cracking. He sounded pathetic, utterly defeated. "You cannot do this. We are your family. I am your father. You cannot throw us out onto the street. We will have nothing. There has to be a way out of this. Tell me what you want. What are your terms?" I stood up slowly, pushing my ergonomic chair back. The movement drew every eye in the room. I towered over them, projecting the absolute unyielding authority they had always tried to strip away from me. I looked down at the 4 people who had orchestrated my destruction and felt nothing but the icy calm of a judge delivering a final verdict. "My terms are not open for negotiation," I said, my voice hard and entirely devoid of emotion. "This is not a mediation session where we compromise to save your pride. This is a surrender. I gestured to Marcus, who stepped forward and placed 4 sleek black pens on the glass table directly in front of the legal documents. You have 2 options, I explained, walking slowly around the edge of the table. Option 1 involves me handing over the complete forensic dossier, including Connor's recorded confession, the routing numbers for the bank fraud, and the evidence of the intellectual property theft, directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service by noon today. Yvonne will face a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and identity theft. Connor will go to prison for corporate espionage and grand larceny. Calvin, you will spend the rest of your natural life fighting federal tax evasion charges from a jail cell. I stopped pacing, standing directly behind Kiara's chair. I could feel her rigid body trembling. Option 2. I continued, my voice dropping into a deadly calm. Register. Requires your immediate and unconditional surrender. I will withhold the federal criminal charges against Yvonne for the forgery. I will withhold the criminal charges against Connor for the intellectual property theft. But in exchange, you will sign over every single share of equity remaining in your respective businesses. Connor, you will legally dissolve your tech firm by the end of business today. All proprietary algorithms revert entirely to my company. Calvin, you will sign over the remaining assets of your logistics firm to cover the outstanding penalties of your audit. I walked back to the head of the table, standing beside Xavier. And finally, you will all sign a permanent ironclad no-contact order, I stated, pointing to the last page of the documents. You will never call me. You will never email me. You will never approach me in public. You will never speak my name to the press or attempt to sell your fabricated sob story to the media. If any of you ever step foot near my properties or my husband's properties again, the federal evidence gets handed over immediately. You will leave this building with absolutely no money, no assets, and no legacy. But you will stay out of federal prison. That is my final offer. The silence returned, pressing down on them with crushing weight. They stared at the black pens resting on the glass table. They looked at the thick stacks of paper outlining their complete ruin. The reality of their situation finally penetrated their suffocating greed. They were completely, inescapably trapped in the web of their own malicious actions. There was no clever loophole. There was no manipulating their way out. They had to choose between living in poverty or living in a cage. Connor was the first to break. He let out a ragged sob, reaching forward with a trembling hand to grab the pen. He did not bother reading the dissolution documents for his company. He just started signing his name, his tears splashing onto the crisp white pages. He signed away his stolen code, his fraudulent business, and his entire future in a matter of seconds. Kiara watched him sign, letting out a sharp, agonizing wail. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The realization had finally hit her. The designer clothes, the luxury cars, the exclusive country club memberships, the wealthy husband, it was all gone. Her entire identity, constructed entirely on stolen money and manufactured prestige, had evaporated. She was nothing but a broke, unemployed woman married to a failed fraud. Calvin stared blankly at the eviction notice. His eyes were completely vacant, stripped of all their former fire and arrogance. He picked up the pen, moving with the slow, mechanical stiffness of a dead man. He signed his name on the line, relinquishing the sprawling colonial estate he had used as a symbol of his power. He signed away his logistics company. He systematically destroyed his own legacy with every stroke of the pen. Yvonne was the last to hold out. She gripped the edge of the glass table, her knuckles turning white. She looked at the pen, then looked up at me, her eyes wide and pleading. She tried one last desperate manipulative tactic, the same tactic she had used to control me when I was a child. Zora. Please, Yvonne whispered, her voice trembling with manufactured affection. You are my beautiful, successful baby. You have achieved so much. You do not have to do this. We can fix this. We can go to therapy. We can be a real family again. Just give us a second chance. I am your mother. I love you. I looked my mother dead in the eye. I felt absolutely nothing. The terrified little girl who used to crave her affection was completely gone, replaced by the woman standing in front of her. "You are looking at the wrong sister," I said, my voice carrying the lethal chill of a winter storm. Yvonne recoiled as if she had been physically struck. Her mouth opened in a silent scream of despair. She finally picked up the pen and began to sign the no-contact order, her hands shaking so badly she could barely form the letters. I did not stay to watch them finish. I had seen exactly what I needed to see. I turned on my heel, the sharp click of my heels echoing off the glass walls, and walked out of the boardroom. I did not look back. The elevator ride down to the ground floor was silent and perfectly smooth. Xavier stood beside me, his presence a steady, immovable force. We walked out of the towering glass building, stepping into the bright, warm morning sunlight. The heavy doors of the waiting Maybach swung open. I slid into the luxurious leather back seat, Xavier settling in right beside me. As the car pulled away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the bustling city traffic, I rested my hand gently on top of Xavier's. The sunlight caught the flawless facets of my own stunning, hard-earned wedding ring, sending a brilliant scatter of light dancing across the dark interior of the car. I leaned my head back against the seat, leaving my toxic family to choke on the dust of their own making. The greatest lesson from Zora's journey is that your worth is never defined by those committed to misunderstanding you. For years, she sought validation from a toxic family that only saw her as a scapegoat. True liberation began the moment she stopped trying to earn their conditional love and started building her own empire in silence. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't loud. It's the quiet, undeniable success of stepping into your own power and finally walking away from the people who tried to keep you small. Share your thoughts in the comments if you have ever had to set hard boundaries with toxic relatives to protect your peace, and do not forget to hit subscribe for more empowering stories.